Welcome to Family Ties and Lies. For every mother and grandmother, the world stopped truly seeing. We tell of good women wronged in silence. And the day they finally look up, not the revenge that burns the world down, the quiet kind. For Scripture promises that nothing hidden stays hidden forever, and the Lord defends the widow and the forgotten. So leave the settling of accounts to Him, and remember, the truth will set you free. Tonight, one woman's story. Listen close. 3 nights before the last ordinary evening of my marriage, I knelt on the cold floor of a room in my own house that I never knew existed, and I held a single sheet of paper in my 2 hands that told me, in plain black ink, exactly how much I was worth to my husband, dead. It was a life insurance policy, a large one. My name was typed on the top line, the insured, and down at the bottom, on the line where the money goes when the insured is gone, sat his name, waiting, like a hand held open for something that was not yet his. 41 years of marriage, and there it was. I was worth more to that man finished than I had ever been worth alive and underfoot. I want to tell you that I screamed or wept or tore the thing in half. I did none of that. The house was very quiet. The furnace ticked low in the wall. I could hear my own heart, slow and far away, like something happening to another woman in another room. And I knelt there on that cold floor and read it a second time, and then a third. The way you read a word, you are certain you must have spelled wrong. If you have ever been told, "Don't you worry about the money, let me handle all that," I need you to hear my story before it is too late to hear your own. Everyone thought my husband was a wonderful man. The neighbors on Larch Street, the deacons at our church, even our own 2 grown children. And for 41 years, God help me, so did I. I let him handle everything, the accounts, the mail, every decision down to the coffee on the shelf. I called it trust. I called it being taken care of. I even called it love. And then, on a winter night with the snow coming sideways off the harbor, and him away at a meeting, I moved a heavy bookcase I had dusted 1,000 times. And behind it, I found a door I was never meant to find. I am not going to tell you yet everything that was in that room. Some of it I can still barely say out loud. But I will tell you this much, so you understand what kind of man I had spent my whole life beside. There was money in there I never knew we had, sitting in the dark, in the very years I was selling my grandmother's pearls to keep our furnace running. There were papers with my own name on them, written in a hand that was not mine. And there was a woman I had never once heard my husband say the name of in 41 years, a woman tied to a whole second life he had built somewhere I had never been, an hour from the bed where he slept beside me every single night. I was 64 years old, kneeling on that cold floor, and I believed my life had just ended. I was wrong. That was the night it finally began. That was the night I stopped being careful. 41 years I had been careful with the money, careful with my questions, careful never to ask the one thing that might bring the whole quiet house down around us both. That night, I set careful down on the floor beside that policy, and I never once picked it up again. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and before we take one more step, I have to tell you something true, because I will not lie to you the way I was lied to. This is not one of those stories where the wicked man stands up in a courtroom and the whole town gasps and he gets everything he has coming to him. I wish to heaven it were. But I have lived long enough to tell you that some men never pay. Some men are loved too well by too many people to ever be made to answer for a single thing. My husband was one of those men. He is gone now, and he died the way he lived, with the whole town still calling him a good man, and not one soul among them ever knew what I knew. So if you came here only to watch him punished, I understand, and I am sorry. That is not what this story has to give. What it has is something quieter, and I have come to believe it is the only thing that was ever truly mine to take back. It is the day a careful, invisible, overlooked woman reaches out and takes the one thing her husband never did manage to steal in time, herself. So let me take you back before the snow, before the safe, before the woman with no name and the paper that had my own death written on it. Back to an ordinary Tuesday evening, the last ordinary evening of my marriage, when I stood at my own kitchen sink steeping a tea bag for exactly 3 minutes, not a second more, because Walter had opinions about tea the way he had opinions about every single thing in our house. I did not know yet that I would ever be free. I only knew that the next morning, when Walter came down the stairs, expecting his careful life to go on exactly as it always had, he would find an envelope waiting for him on the kitchen table. Inside would be divorce papers, signed, and one more sheet of paper, written in my own hand, the very hand he had once forged to quietly steal a future out from under me. On that sheet were 4 words. I knew everything, Walter. If you have ever stayed quiet just to keep the peace, or told yourself it was simply too late to begin again, then you already know the hardest part of this story is not the lie my husband told me. It is how many years I spent telling it to myself. And it began, the way these things so often do, with a man the whole world admired. To understand how I came to be kneeling in front of that safe, you first have to understand the man the whole town thought they knew. And to understand him, you have to understand our corner of Portland, Maine, in the deep of winter, where the harbor freezes at the edges, and people keep their business tucked behind storm doors and high snowbanks. For 41 years, if you had stopped anyone on Larch Street and asked about my husband, they would have reached for the same word, solid. Walter Whitfield was a solid man. A pressed shirt, even on a Saturday. A handshake people trusted with their savings. And for 30 years he managed money for half the families in our parish, and never, as far as anyone knew, lost a dime that was not his to lose. He sat on the church finance committee beside Raymond Boyd, who always saved Walter the good seat near the front, and told anyone who would listen the parish was blessed to have a man so careful with the Lord's money. People did not just respect my husband. They were grateful to him. And that gratitude, I learned far too late, was the thickest wall he ever built. But I did not marry the man in the pressed shirts. I met Walter 42 winters ago in the library where I worked, when a soaked-through young fellow came in out of the rain and asked me, straight-faced, whether we kept any books on how a man could stop being broke. I laughed. He laughed. He stayed until closing, arguing that poetry was a waste of money. And 11 months later, I married him, believing I was the luckiest girl in Maine. In those first years, he tucked little notes inside the books on my nightstand and drove us to the breakwater to watch the boat lights. And I want you to know I was no fool to love him. A woman loved like that does not walk into a cage. She walks into a future. I cannot tell you the day the light went down, because there was no such day. The notes stopped. The drives stopped. The earnestness stayed, but the warmth drained out of it. When we married, I had been head librarian at the branch where we met, and Walter, in the gentlest voice you ever heard, said there was no reason for me to spend my days reshelving other people's books, not on his income, and would it not be simpler to keep things to the one account? He said it like a kindness. He said nearly everything like a kindness. And the answer to every question I ever asked about money became 3 reasonable words. We have to be careful. But I have never told a living soul what I am about to tell you now. There was a sign right there in those early years, and I held it in my own 2 hands and let it go. It began with the telephone. Our heavy black telephone on the hall table would ring in the evening, and I would answer, and there would be a woman on the line who did not speak. Not silence exactly, a held breath, the sound of someone listening, gathering herself, and then the soft click of the receiver going down. Once a month, then twice, always in the early evening, always before Walter was home. I remember the last of those calls, because it was the night I very nearly learned everything 20 years too soon. It was a winter evening, the snow ticking against the glass, and the telephone rang, and I answered, and there was the breathing. But this time the woman did not hang up. This time, in a voice worn thin and trembling, she said, "Please, you have to know what he—" And a hand came down over mine on the receiver. I had not heard Walter come in. He was right behind me, still in his coat, snow melting on his shoulders. And he lifted the telephone out of my hand so gently and so quickly that I never heard the rest of what that woman was trying to tell me. He set it back in its cradle, and then he just stood there, very still, his hand resting on the phone, and he did not say one word. I have turned that moment over for 40 years, because when he finally looked at me, his face was not angry. For one breath before he caught it and smoothed it away, I saw something I had never seen on my husband before and would not understand until it was far too late. It looked like grief. It looked, God help me, almost like a man standing in a doorway he could still choose to walk through. And I believe to this day that some small, buried part of him wanted to, that Walter Whitfield came within a single breath there in our front hall with the snow coming down, of turning to me and telling the truth. Then he smiled, the warm, easy smile the whole town trusted. "These telephone people," he said, "they will say anything to keep you on the line." He kissed my forehead, and he went to hang up his coat, and whatever door had opened in him for that one moment swung shut, and it stayed shut for the rest of our marriage. I never got another of those calls. I told myself the wrong numbers had simply stopped, and I was glad, and I did not let myself wonder why they ended that very night, or what a stranger could have to warn me about, or why a careful man had crossed a room so fast. I know now that woman had spent years trying to find the courage to tell me what I had married, and the one night she nearly managed it, the man I trusted took the words out of her mouth, kissed my forehead, and let me go on sleeping beside him as if nothing in the world were wrong. It would be 20 long years before she found her way close enough to try again. If you want to know how a marriage turns into a cage, I can tell you. I lived inside one for the better part of 41 years and never once saw the bars. A cage like that is not built with locks and chains. It is built with 100 small, reasonable no's, each one so sensible on its own that you would feel foolish and ungrateful to argue. The blue dress in the shop window downtown was $120, the color of the harbor just before dark, and I stood in the cold and tried it on and put it back, and Walter never even knew, because by then the stopping happened inside me on its own, the way your hand flinches from a hot stove. I could already hear him, that patient tilt of the head, asking wherever I imagined we would find $120 when we had to be so careful. That was the word. He had said it so reasonably for so many years that it stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like the weather. And under that weather, I shrank. I colored my own hair gray at the kitchen sink rather than pay a salon. I turned the collar on my good coat and told the women at church I liked it that way. What I never quite gave up were the small, secret ways I stayed myself. I took a few holiday shifts at the flower shop on Forest Avenue and kept the cash folded in a coffee tin behind the flower. Not for spending, just for the knowing it was there. And one winter, when the furnace died, I drove 2 towns over where no one knew my face and sold my grandmother's pearl bracelet. And I cried in the car, not over the pearls, but because I had to do it in secret, in my own marriage, to keep the heat on in my own home. Nobody sees the bars on a cage like that. There are no bars. There is only a woman who has learned to want less and less, until wanting nothing at all looks exactly like contentment. The night it broke open was an ordinary Tuesday. I carried a cup of tea down the hall to the little back study, the way I had 1,000 times, and I found the door shut. I turned the handle out of habit, and it did not give. It was locked. I knocked lightly and called his name. There was a pause, the smallest pause, and then the scrape of his chair, and when he opened the door he was already smiling, easy and warm, and he took the tea and thanked me and said he was only sorting some old files he did not want disturbed. He kissed my forehead. He started to close the door, and for the first time in I cannot tell you how many years, I did not simply let him. "Walter," I said, as lightly as I could manage, my heart going faster than the question deserved, When did we put a lock on that door?" He stopped. It was only a half second, but I had poured this man 10,000 cups of tea, and I knew the rhythm of him the way you know a clock in your own house. And that half second was wrong. Then he turned back, smooth as ever, and said the old latch had been sticking for months, and he had finally had a fellow out to set it right. He said it kindly. He said it the way he said everything. But I want to tell you what I saw in that half second before the kindness came back down over his face like a shade being drawn. I saw the man underneath the husband. His eyes went flat and cool and still, measuring me, the way you might measure a lock yourself to see whether it will hold. There was no warmth in it at all. It was gone so fast I could have told myself I imagined it. And for years I did. But I know now it was the first true look I ever got at what lived inside Walter Whitfield. Not a man caught, a man calculating. Then he smiled and kissed my forehead a second time and shut the door. And I heard the new lock turn quietly into place behind him. I went back to the kitchen and washed a cup that did not need washing. And because something in that half second would not let me rest, I did a thing I had never done. I lifted the lid off the kitchen bin to throw out the tea leaves. And there, sitting right on top, was the old doorknob he had told me was broken. I picked it out of the trash and turned the latch with my thumb. It worked perfectly, smooth, easy, not a thing wrong with it. He had not replaced a broken lock at all. He had taken a working one off our door and put on a lock that needed a key. And then he had looked me in the eye in our own hallway and lied about why. And underneath that doorknob, half folded, was a receipt from a hardware store I had never heard of in a coastal town a full hour north of Portland. Whatever my husband had needed, he had driven an hour up the coast to buy it, so that not one soul who knew his face would ever see him carry it home. I stood there in my own kitchen with the doorknob in one hand and the receipt in the other. And I finally understood that the locked door was not the secret. The locked door was only the lid, and I had just seen, for half a second, the face of the man who had built whatever was sealed beneath it. What I did not yet know was how far beneath it went. The locked door had planted something in me that would not lie back down. For weeks I told myself it was nothing, the way I had told myself everything was nothing for 41 years. But a wrongness, once you have finally let yourself feel it, does not go back to sleep. It waits. And mine was still waiting. On the gray January morning, a pipe burst in the wall behind the hall closet, and the plumber could not come until afternoon. And I had to empty out 40 years of stored boxes myself to get at the soaked plaster. I knelt on the cold floor in my sweater, with water ticking somewhere down inside the wall, and I began pulling out the boxes we had carried from house to house and never once opened. The sediment of a long marriage, Christmas ornaments wrapped in yellowed tissue, the children's old report cards, tax folders gone soft at the corners, and at the very back, crushed flat beneath a carton of Walter's old files, an envelope that had slid down behind everything years ago, or had been pushed there. It was addressed to me, to Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, and it had never been opened. I knelt there, holding it a long moment, before I understood what it was. The return address was the public library. My library. The branch where I had given the best years of my young working life, before Walter gently talked me out of them. The postmark, when I held it up to the light, was 9 years old. 9 years. I opened it there on the floor, the water still dripping inside the dark of the wall, and I read a letter that should have changed the last decade of my life. It was an invitation. The branch where I had once been head librarian was opening a position again, and my name had come up, warmly, more than once, among people who still remembered my work. They wondered whether I might consider coming back, even part-time, in whatever way suited me. The words were kind and specific, and full of a respect I had not felt pointed in my direction in years. Someone out there had remembered I was good at something. Someone had wanted me back. And I had never known. For 9 years I had believed that part of my life was simply finished, that the world had no use for a woman my age who had let her career lapse for a marriage. I had folded that grief up small and learned to live around it. And the whole time the door had been standing open, and a hand had reached through it to find me, and no one had ever told me. I sat back on my heels, and the cold came up through me from the floor. And then I saw the second sheet clipped behind the first, and the cold turned to something harder. It was a photocopy, the careful kind an office keeps for its records, a reply they had received to that invitation, a gracious, gentle decline, thanking them for thinking of me, explaining that I was very happy at home and not looking to return to work, and wishing them every blessing. And at the bottom, signed in a careful, looping hand made to look exactly like mine, was my own name, Eleanor Whitfield. I had never seen that letter. I had never written one word of it. My husband had opened my mail, read the one piece of good news the world had sent me in a decade, and answered it in my name, in my voice, and shut the door on my behalf so quietly that I lived 9 more years on the other side of it, and never once felt the latch. I want to tell you, I cried. I did not. I had cried over a sharp word, over a locked door. This was past crying. I knelt on that wet floor and felt something cold and clear and terribly steady settle over me. But that is not the part I have never been able to forget. Because there was a third sheet, loose, that had slipped out of the envelope into my lap, and when I unfolded it, my hands went still. It was a practice page, my signature, written over and over, line after line, down the whole length of the paper. The first few were clumsy, a man's careful copying, the loops not quite right, but they grew better as they went down the page, steadier, truer, until the very last one, at the bottom, was my own name in what might as well have been my own hand. I could not have told you myself which of us had written it. My husband had sat somewhere in this house, alone, and practiced being me. Not once in a moment of weakness, patiently, the way you learn a skill you fully intend to use again. And kneeling there, I understood at last that the locked door and this letter were not two strange and separate things. They were the same thing, the same patient, deliberate man who would drive an hour up the coast to buy a lock no neighbor would see him carry home, was the man who had sat in the quiet and practiced my signature until he could sign my whole life away in my own hand without a tremor. A man does not learn that for one letter. He learns it for what he means to do later. I refolded all 3 pages along their old creases and slid them into the pocket of my sweater. I finished emptying the boxes so that nothing would look disturbed. I made Walter his supper that night, and I asked about his day, and I smiled. And inside me, in a room he had never once thought to look in, a woman who had been asleep for 41 years opened her eyes the rest of the way. Whatever else my husband had practiced in the dark, I was going to find every last page of it. It was a Tuesday evening in February when the knock came, hard and fast, the kind of knock that goes straight through a house and into your chest before your mind has caught up to it. I was at the sink. Walter was in his chair with a paper. I opened the door and found my daughter on the step in the storm with no proper coat, the snow blowing sideways behind her, her face wet before the weather had touched it. And I knew before she said a single word that something had broken. Laura was 36 years old, and she had not cried in front of me since she was a girl. She was a proud woman, my Laura, the kind who would drive home on a bad tire rather than ask her mother for the price of a new one. And she was crying now, on my step, in the storm. She got it out in pieces. It was Charlie, my grandson, 7 years old, the brightest small light in the whole of my life. There was something wrong with his lungs, something the doctors had found and did not like, something that needed a specialist down in Boston and a course of treatment that could not wait. Their insurance would cover a part and leave the rest, and the rest was $3,000, and they needed it this week before the appointment. And she and her husband did not have it and did not know where it would come from. So she had done the hardest thing a proud daughter can do. She had come home. I brought her into the warm kitchen and sat her down. And Walter came in from the front room, drawn by the noise, and stood in the doorway in his cardigan with his reading glasses pushed up into his hair. And he listened to our daughter beg. I want you to understand what I expected, even 3 weeks into knowing what I knew. Some old part of me still expected the man the whole town admired, the grandfather who had bounced Charlie on his knee at Christmas and called him my boy. I expected him to cross that kitchen and put his hand on Laura's shoulder and say, of course we will find it." He did not move. He let her finish, every word of it, his head tilted in that patient, listening way. And I was watching him now the way I had learned to watch everything, and I will tell you what I saw. For 1 second, 1 single second, something moved behind his eyes. His jaw tightened. He looked for that one breath, like a man with a war going on inside him. And then he lost it, or he set it down, and I will never know which. He sighed, the soft, reasonable sigh of a sensible man faced with an unreasonable request. And he said he was very sorry, but it simply was not possible just now. He said money was tight. He said everyone had to be careful. And then he said the thing I will carry to my grave. He said, "Perhaps Laura ought to ask the hospital about a payment plan." A payment plan. For a 7-year-old who could not catch his breath. I have spent a long time trying to name what happened inside me in that moment, and the closest I can come is this. Something that had been bent in me for 41 years did not break. It straightened. I watched my daughter understand that her own father, a man I now half suspected was sitting on more money than either of us could dream of, would let her child go without, rather than open a door he had decided to keep shut. And a cold, clear fury rose up in me that I had never once felt inside those walls. I did not argue with him. Arguing was his country, and he had never lost a fight on his own ground. There was a moment, God forgive me, when the words sat right there in my throat. "I know about the money, Walter." I almost said it. And then the new, careful, watchful part of me, the part that had been asleep for 41 years and was only now waking, put a hand across my own mouth. Not yet. If I showed him tonight what I knew, I would lose everything I had not yet finished gathering. So I swallowed it whole. I put my own coat over Laura's shoulders, and I walked my daughter back out into the snow, away from him. And there, by her car, in the blowing dark, I did the only thing I could. I had never told a living soul about the coffee tin behind the flower, the cash I had earned in secret and kept against a storm I prayed would never come. The storm had come. It was $900, folded soft from years of handling. It was not $3,000. After 41 years of marriage, $900 in a coffee tin was the whole of what I could call my own. And the shame of that nearly closed my throat. But I pressed it into my daughter's cold hands and folded her fingers shut around it. And I told her it was a start, that we would find the rest, that she was not alone. She tried to give it back. I would not let her. A mother knows the difference between pride and a child who cannot breathe. She drove off into the storm with my whole heart in the passenger seat. And I stood in the driveway until her taillights were swallowed in the white. When I came back inside, Walter had already gone back to his chair and his paper, and without lifting his eyes from the page, he asked me whether Laura had calmed down. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the back of his head, and I made him a promise he could not hear. Whatever was behind that locked door, whatever he had practiced in the dark, my grandson would never again go without, while a single dollar of it sat hidden in this house. After the night I put $900 into my daughter's frozen hands, something in me changed, and it did not change back. For 41 years I had moved through my own house with my eyes half shut, the way you learn to when seeing a thing only makes it harder to live beside. Now I could not stop seeing. It was as if the librarian I had been, before Walter talked her out of it, had finally sat up inside me and begun, very quietly, to take notes. And the trouble with notes is that they add up. I began to notice the things a wife trains herself not to see. The little paper shredder in the study, which had sat gathering dust for years, now ran in the evenings after he thought I had gone up to bed. I would lie in the dark and hear it through the floor, that low, mechanical whine, going on far longer than a few old papers could take. Whatever my husband was feeding into it, there was a great deal of it, and he did it at an hour when he believed no one was awake to wonder. His telephone changed, too. For years it had lived face up on the kitchen counter, like everyone else's. Now it went everywhere with him, in his shirt pocket, against his chest, and when it rang after supper, he did not answer it at the table. He carried it out onto the cold back porch, pulled the door shut behind him, and stood out there in the dark with his back to the window, talking to someone in a low voice I could not catch. His laptop did the strangest thing of all. When I passed the open study door, the screen would go dark under his hand in one smooth motion, the way you cover a thing you do not want a child to see. He had never once shown me what was on it. I had never once thought to ask. That was the marriage we had built. He kept, and I did not look. But I was looking now. The hardest of it came on an ordinary Thursday. I was in the hallway with a dust cloth, doing the small, invisible work I had done my whole life, when I heard Walter on the porch, his voice low, certain he was alone. I did not mean to listen. I want that set down plainly. But the words came through the gap in the door, and once I had heard them, I could not unhear them. "She doesn't know anything," he said, calm, reassuring, the same voice he used on grieving widows and nervous committee men. "There's nothing for you to worry about. I stood frozen with the cloth in my hand, and for one sick moment the floor tilted under me, because I was certain the she was me, that he was out there reassuring someone that his foolish wife suspected nothing. And God help me, he would have been right. I didn't. But then he said something else, softer, that did not fit. A few words about papers and a date and being patient just a little longer. And slowly, horribly, I understood that the she on the other end of that call, the she who was worried, the she who needed soothing, was not me at all. Somewhere out there in the dark was another woman entirely, and my husband was promising her, gently, that his wife of 41 years was no danger to whatever they were doing, because his wife did not know a thing. It should have frightened me into stillness. Instead, it did the opposite. Something hardened in me that afternoon, quietly, the way water turns to ice without a single sound. I finished dusting. I made his supper. I asked how his day had been and listened to him lie to me across the table with that warm, reasonable face. And I smiled, and I said nothing. And inside, I was no longer a wife who suspected. I was a woman who had decided to find out. The last of it happened near midnight, a week later. I woke and found Walter's side of the bed cold and empty. I came down the stairs in my robe, and I saw a thin line of light under the door to the garage. I did not turn on the hall lamp. I crossed the cold kitchen floor in my bare feet, one slow step at a time, my heart going so hard I was sure it would give me away. And I stood close to that door and listened to my husband speak to someone in a hushed, urgent voice I had not heard from him in 20 years. Most of it I could not make out. But I heard one word clearly, said twice, the way you say a name that matters. Francis. Then a pause, then, softer, almost tender. Frances again. And something turned over in the very bottom of me, because I had heard a woman on our telephone once, a lifetime ago, a breathing in the dark that only ever came when Walter was not yet home. I had never had a name to put to it. I felt the name drop into the empty place that breathing had left behind. And though I could not yet have told you how, I knew, the way you know your own front step in the dark, that they were one and the same woman. I went back up the stairs before he could find me there. I lay down beside the cold sheets and said the name over and over, so the morning could not take it from me. Frances. Whoever she was the center of all of it. She was the worried she on the porch, and the breathing on the line, and the tenderness my husband had never once spent on me. And lying there in the dark, listening to Walter come quietly back to bed and pretend he had never left it, I made up my mind. Before he could finish whatever the two of them were building, I was going to find her. For a week I carried that name everywhere. Frances. I said it over the dishes, lying awake beside Walter's sleeping back, watching him butter his toast in the morning like a most ordinary man alive. I had decided to find out what he was hiding, but deciding is the easy part. The doing of it frightened me, because to do it, I had to go into the one room in our house that was never truly mine, the study. And the study, since that winter, had a brand new lock on its door. But a watchful woman learns things, and I had been watching for weeks. A careful man keeps a spare to everything, for fear of being shut out of his own secrets. One afternoon, dusting where I had no reason to, I found Walter's spare key taped under a kitchen drawer, in a spot a wife was never meant to clean. I left it where it lay. I only needed to know it was there. My chance came on a gray Sunday. Walter had a finance meeting at the church, the long kind that ran past supper, and the moment his car turned the corner, I felt the whole house change around me, the way a held breath changes a room. I peeled the spare key from beneath the drawer, I went down the hall, and I let myself into my husband's study with my heart in my throat. I had cleaned that room 1,000 times. I knew the desk, the lamp, the tall oak bookcase covering the back wall, floor to ceiling. Or I thought I did. I went through the desk first, quietly, putting each thing back exactly as I found it. Bills, old tax folders, the ordinary paper of an ordinary life. Nothing. I checked the drawers for false bottoms, feeling like a fool, a woman of 64, patting her own husband's furniture like a thief. Still nothing. And I might have given up. I might have told myself I had imagined all of it, the shredder and the porch and the name in the dark, if I had not knelt to put back a book I had knocked from the bottom shelf and seen the carpet. There was a mark worn into the pile in front of the bookcase, a faint curved line, a pale arc, the kind of track a heavy thing leaves when it is swung across the same patch of floor, over and over, for years. A bookcase that has stood still since we moved in does not leave a mark like that. A bookcase that opens does. My heart began to beat so hard I could feel it in my hands. I set my palms against the side of the case and pushed, gently, then harder. And with a low, reluctant groan, the whole tall thing swung out from the wall on a hidden hinge, the books riding with it, and the cold breath of a space that had no business existing sighed out at me from the dark. There was a door back there, a plain steel door, set flush into the wall, painted the exact gray of the plaster, so that even with the bookcase swung open, your eye could slide right past it. I stood with my hand pressed over my mouth, staring at a door in my own house that I had leaned against, dusted, lived beside for over 40 years, and never once known was there. It was not locked, and that frightened me more than any lock could have. The sheer arrogance of it, a man so certain his wife would never look that he did not trouble himself to keep her out. I pulled it open, and behind it was a small, windowless room, hardly bigger than a closet, the air close and used, the air of a place a person stands in often. There was a worn patch on the bare floor the size of a kneeling man, and bolted to that floor, squat and gray and patient, sat a safe, a real one, heavy, serious, with a round dial on its face, and the look of a thing built to keep a secret as long as its owner needed it kept. I did not touch it. I want you to know that, because every part of me wanted to. I stood there with my own breath loud in my ears and did not lay a finger on that dial, because I understood, all at once, that whatever was inside could never be unknown again. Behind that steel door was the answer to every small wrong thing I had felt for years and called imaginary. The locked study, the shredder, the porch, the name. It was all in there, 2 feet in front of me, and I was not yet ready. And then headlights swept across the little window down the hall. I froze. A car was coming up Larch Street, slowing, and for one horrible moment I was certain it was his, that the meeting had let out early, that I would be found inside the one place I was never meant to be. The car did not stop. It went on past, a neighbor, nothing, and I stood shaking with my hand on cold steel and understood for the first time how little time a woman like me has. So I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I closed the steel door. I swung the heavy bookcase back along its worn arc in the carpet, and I checked, twice, that every book sat exactly where it had sat. I locked the study behind me and pressed the spare key back beneath the drawer. And I sat down at my own kitchen table on legs that did not feel like mine and waited for my hands to stop shaking. They did not for a long while. That night, Walter came home, pleased with himself, and told me all about his meeting. And I made his tea, and I smiled, and inside I was still standing in that small, dark room. I had found the door. I had found the safe. Now only one thing stood between me and the truth. I needed the code. I had found the door. I had found the safe. And for days, the only thing between me and the truth was a row of numbers I did not have. I lay awake turning combinations over the way you worry a loose tooth, knowing I could not just spin the dial at random, knowing a man as careful as Walter would have chosen something he could never forget, and I could never guess. Or so he believed. So I did what I had always done best, though I had not done it in 40 years. I watched, and I searched. The hardware receipt beneath that doorknob had given me one thing: the name of a small coastal town a full hour north of Portland. And in the evenings, while Walter believed I was reading, I went quietly looking for any Frances who lived up that way. It is slow work with only a first name, but I found one, a Frances Pruitt, an address near the water, a woman who left almost no footprint at all. I had no proof she was anything to my husband. Not yet. The proof came on a Thursday, 3 nights after I found the safe, riding in on a little too much wine. Walter came home from a church dinner, looser than he ever let himself be in front of the town, warm and pleased and unguarded, the version of himself nobody else was allowed to see. After he believed I had gone up to bed, I heard him go down the hall to the study. I stood at the top of the stairs in the dark, in my nightgown, and then I came down, one slow step at a time, and stood in the shadow of the hall, and watched my husband kneel in front of that open steel door and turn the dial. He was in no hurry. He had no reason to be. He turned it left, then right, then left again, and I watched his fingers stop at each number and burned them into my memory. 0, 4, 1, 9. The handle gave. The safe swung open. And then Walter did a thing that has stayed with me longer than any document I ever found in that house. He reached in and took out something small, and he held it up into the lamplight, and he looked at it. And his face, the face I had watched go flat and cold in our hallway, the face that had told our daughter to find a payment plan, that face went soft, soft the way a young man's goes. His lips moved, and though I could not hear it, I knew the shape of the word, Frances. He sat on the floor of that hidden room and looked at whatever he was holding, the way a man looks at the one good thing in his life. Then he set it back and closed the door, and I was up the stairs and under the covers with my heart slamming before he ever rose to his feet. 0, 4, 1, 9. I said it to myself all night. 04/19, the 19th of April. And here is the thing that turned my blood cold as I lay there. It was not a date that meant a single thing to us. Not my birthday, not Walter's, not the day we married, not the birthday of either of our children, nor our grandson, nor one anniversary in 41 years of a shared life. I went through every date that had ever mattered to us, and the 19th of April was a stranger among them, a day that belonged to no part of the life I knew. So whose day was it? I think somewhere in me I already knew, but I made myself be a researcher and not a wife. In the morning, after Walter left, I drove to the library, my old library, and I sat down at the public computer, and I looked up the only Frances I had found up that coastal road, Frances Pruitt. And there, in a plain public record, was a date of birth, the 19th of April. I sat very still in that quiet reading room. The code to my husband's deepest secret, the numbers that guarded everything he had hidden from me, was not a date from our marriage at all. It was the birthday of a woman I had never met. He had locked his whole secret world behind the one number he would never, ever forget, and it was hers. After 41 years, my own birthday sat forgotten on a calendar on our kitchen wall, and a stranger's birthday opened the only door in that house that mattered. I cannot fully explain what that did to me. It was one thing to suspect another woman. It was another thing entirely to learn that this Frances Pruitt lived so deep inside my husband's mind that he had made her birthday the lock on his whole hidden life, while mine he could not have told you without checking. I had the code now. I could have driven him to that church the next Sunday, waited for his car to round the corner, and opened that safe within the hour. Every part of me wanted to. My hands actually itched for the dial, and yet I did not. I sat at that library table with the numbers in my head and a storm in my chest. And I made myself stop, because the librarian in me knew that opening the safe was the last move, not the first. If I opened it now, in a rush of hurt, I would have shock and grief and a head full of papers I did not understand. And Walter would still know more than I did, the way he always had. No. Before I opened that door, I was going to understand the woman whose birthday unlocked it. I was going to find out who Frances Pruitt truly was and what she was to my husband, and why a tired stranger an hour up the coast held the key to my whole marriage. I closed the computer and I went to find her. I had the code now, but I did not use it. For 3 nights, the wanting nearly undid me. If I opened that safe in a rush and found only money and a stranger's name, I would have shock and grief and nothing I could use. Walter had spent 41 years winning every argument by knowing more than I did, and I would not walk into the biggest fight of my life knowing less. So I did the one thing my husband never once imagined I would do. I went back to being a librarian. He had talked me out of that work 40 winters ago, as if it were a small thing, a hobby I would not miss. He never understood that it was never about reshelving books. It was about knowing how to find what other people could not, how to follow a single name through public records the way a hound follows a scent, never losing the thread. For decades that skill had sat in me unused, a tool he had set on a high shelf and forgotten. Now I took it down and blew the dust off it. I started at my old branch, where the young woman at the desk did not know I had once sat where she sat. While a search loaded, my eye fell on a boy at the corner table, 8 or 9, doing his homework alone with his coat still zipped, and it pulled an old memory loose. There had been a boy like that years ago when I worked there, a serious, quiet child whose mother cleaned offices at night, who used to stay at that same corner table until closing because there was no one home to go to. I had let him stay. One hard winter, I bought him a hot lunch and told him I had an extra ticket, so he would take it without shame. I had not thought of him in 20 years. I wondered whatever became of children like that, the ones the world nearly forgets, the ones a single small kindness might turn in a different direction. Then the search finished, and the boy slipped out of my mind. I did not know yet how close he still was. I did not know I would come to need him. I worked the name I had whispered to myself in the dark. Frances Pruitt. The first results gave me almost nothing, but research is patience, and patience I had in abundance after 41 years of waiting. I tried different spellings. I matched the coastal address against property records. I traced a tax filing, a lapsed license. Piece by piece, the way you build a puzzle from its edges in, a shape began to come up out of the blank. The first thing that surprised me was a photograph in an old church newsletter from that little coastal town. I had braced myself for a rival, polished and younger and pleased with herself. The woman who looked back at me was nothing of the kind. Frances Pruitt was near my own age, 66, with tired eyes and a thin cardigan worn through at the elbow, standing at the edge of a parish supper as though she were not quite sure she was allowed to be there. She did not look like a woman who had been handed a hidden fortune. She looked like a woman who had been worn down to the bone. That did not fit. And when a thing does not fit, a good researcher keeps pulling. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. Frances's name surfaced where I least expected it. Not on love letters, not on vacation receipts, on the dry incorporation papers of a small consulting firm, a business I had never once heard Walter mention in all our years. Her name sat on those documents as a partner, a signatory, an officer of a company, and threaded quietly through the very same filings, in the careful, indirect way these things are done, were the marks of my husband's hand. The two names, his and hers, ran alongside each other down a decade of paperwork like two rails of the same track. I sat back from the screen and tried to make the pieces mean what I had assumed they meant. But a mistress does not become an officer of your company. A man hiding a lover does not put her signature on his financial papers. Whatever Frances Pruitt was to Walter, it was colder and more deliberate than any love story. He was not spending money on her. He was using her name to hold it. And there was one more thing, smaller, that I almost slid right past and have wished ever since I had not. Here and there through those same filings, just often enough, were names I half knew. A man from the church, a name from the bank, respectable names, good names, the kind that get the front pew and the firm handshake, braided quietly into Walter's paper the way Frances's was. I did not understand it yet, but some cold, careful part of me filed it away and thought, he did not build this alone, and the men who helped him will not want it found. I printed nothing. I wrote what I needed in my own shorthand in a small notebook and tucked it into the lining of my purse. Then I wiped the search history, the way the girl at the desk would never have guessed an older woman knew, and I gathered my coat. I walked out into the cold, bright afternoon, feeling something I had not felt in years. Not safety, capability. For the first time in this whole nightmare, I was not waiting to be told what was being done to me. I was finding it out for myself, with the one weapon Walter never thought to take seriously, because he had never thought to take me seriously at all. He had filed me away like a book he was sure no one would ever read again. But first I had to understand who Frances Pruitt really was, and the answer, when it came, would undo everything I thought I knew about my own marriage. I had gone looking for a mistress. What I found instead was a wife. After the library, when I understood that Frances Pruitt was not a girlfriend in a seaside cottage, but a name threaded through my husband's secret money, I could not let it lie. A signature on a shell company is a strange sort of betrayal. It is not passion, it is paperwork. And paperwork leaves a trail a patient woman can follow. And patient I had become. So I went back and dug deeper than I ever had into the dry official records that hold the real shape of a life. I found her marriages first. People believe those records are private. They are not to someone willing to sit and look. And there, in a county registry from a town I had never set foot in, was a record of marriage between Walter Whitfield and Frances Pruitt. I nearly passed it by, thinking it some accident of common names, until I saw the date. The date was the thing that stopped my heart. They had married more than 2 years before Walter ever walked into my library out of the rain. 2 years before he leaned on my desk and asked whether we had any books on how a man could stop being broke. While he was courting me, tucking notes into the books on my nightstand, and promising me a life built brick by patient brick, Walter Whitfield was already a married man. I told myself there had to be a divorce. Of course there was a divorce. A man does not stay married to one woman while he marries another. Not for 41 years, not a deacon, not a man the whole town trusted with its money. So I went looking for it, the way you go looking for the one piece that will make a terrible puzzle harmless again. There was no divorce. I checked every county they had ever lived in under both their names, every spelling I could think of, and the record simply was not there, because the thing it would have recorded never happened. Walter had married Frances, grown tired of her, walked away without ever ending it on paper, and then, still bound to her in the eyes of the law, he stood up in a church in front of God and my own mother and married me. For 41 years, I had believed I was Walter Whitfield's wife. I need you to sit with that the way I had to. In the eyes of the law, I never was. The wedding I remembered, the ring I had worn until it went thin, the name I had carried through 4 decades, may never have been a marriage at all. I was the second woman, the one who did not know. The whole respectable life we had built had been balanced the entire time on a lie buried so deep that even I, who lived inside it, never once felt the floor was hollow. I did not cry, though Lord knows I had the right. What I felt was stranger than grief, a kind of vertigo, as if the floor of my whole history had tilted, and everything I thought I had been was sliding toward the edge. Who was I, if I had never truly been his wife? What were my children, born inside a marriage that was not one? What had I given up all those years, and for what, if even the cage had been a fiction? And then I asked the question I had circled for years without letting it land. Not what Walter had done to me. I knew what he had done. The harder question, the one that sat in my chest like a stone, was what I had done to myself. Because somewhere in those 41 years, in some locked room of my own, I think I had known. Not the safe, not Frances, Not the forged letter, but the shape of it. The way every question about money was turned gently aside. The way the doors were his and the accounts were his, and the answer was always that we had to be careful. I had felt the wrongness for decades, and 100 times chosen not to look, because looking would have cost me the only life I knew. I told myself staying small was a kind of peace, and it was easier. God forgive me. So much easier. To be a woman things were done to, than a woman who might have to do something about it. That is the part I have had to carry ever since. Walter built the lie, but for 41 years I helped him keep it quiet. And then, slowly, underneath the vertigo and the shame, something colder and clearer began to rise. Because I am not only a woman who was wronged, I am a librarian, and a librarian knows the power of a document. Whatever it did to my heart, my mind had already begun to see what it was in my 2 hands. This was the worst thing I had ever learned about my husband. It was also dangerous, in ways I did not yet fully understand. A truth that could cut both ways, that could wound me and my children, even as it ruined him. I would have to handle it as carefully as anything I had ever touched. But it was leverage. It was a thread that, pulled the right way, could unravel everything Walter had spent his careful life protecting. I thought of the safe down the hall, its dial set to this woman's birthday. I thought of the money, and the ledger I had not yet seen, and the long years of his secret running alongside Francis's borrowed name. I had wanted proof and understanding. Now I understood far more than I had ever wanted to. And there was only one thing left to do. Open that steel door and gather every last piece into my own 2 hands. I closed the computer. The wanting was gone now, and in its place was something steadier and far more frightening. Resolve. It was time. The next time Walter left, I was going to open the safe. The night I finally opened it, the storm did half the work for me. Walter had a finance meeting at the church, and by afternoon the snow had turned mean, blowing sideways off the harbor while the radio told everyone who could to stay home. He went anyway. He would never miss a room full of men who were grateful to him. I watched his taillights blur into the white at the end of Larch Street, then made myself wait 10 more minutes by the kitchen clock until I was sure the storm had swallowed him whole. Then I went down the hall, took the spare key from beneath the drawer, let myself into the study, moved the bookcase along its worn arc, and knelt in front of the safe. My hands did not shake the way they had the first night. That frightened me a little, how steady they were. Some part of me had already crossed over into the woman I was about to become, the one who does not tremble because she has already decided. I turned the dial to the date that was no birthday in our family, the 19th of April. The handle gave, and the heavy door swung open into the lamplight. I had braced for the cash, and the cash was there, more than I had ever seen outside a teller's window, banded stacks of 50s and 100s in neat rows. But it was not the money that took the air out of me. It was the paperwork packed in around it, the way you pack straw around a thing you are afraid will break. There were account statements thick as a parish directory, with balances that turned 41 years of being careful into a joke told at my expense. There was a folder for that condominium an hour up the coast, on the very road he had driven to buy a lock no neighbor would see, leased and furnished and waiting, a utility bill already in his name. And beneath all of it, a single sheet of ledger paper in Walter's small, precise hand, a column of transfers running back year after year, and there, again and again down the margin, a borrowed name, Frances Pruitt. I read it slowly, the way I had once read difficult records for patrons who could not make sense of them alone. Years of moving money in the dark, while across the supper table he asked, so reasonably, wherever I imagined we would find $120 for a winter dress. And at the very bottom of the page, underlined once, he had left himself a note. Delay all major transfers if she begins to suspect. Hold until retirement is finalized. She, after 41 years, I was not even a name. I was a pronoun in the margin of his planning, a risk to be timed around the way you time around weather. I waited for the tears. They did not come. What came instead was a cold I had never felt before. Not grief, and not even anger exactly, but a terrible clarity, as if a window I had spent my whole life breathing fog onto had finally been wiped clean. For the first time, I could see the whole shape of my own life, and I saw, with no comfort in it, that the man I had served and feared and made 10,000 cups of tea for had been quietly building himself a way out of my life long before I knew it was finished. And then I found the one warm thing in that cold gray box, and it undid me worse than all the rest. It was a photograph, soft and worn thin at the corners from handling. A young woman, laughing, on a beach somewhere, a whole lifetime ago. It took me a moment to know her, because I had only ever seen her tired and 66. But it was Frances, young Frances, the one small treasure in a vault built entirely to deceive me, and it was her face. Every tender thing left in that man he had locked away in the dark with his money and spent on someone else. I got the careful coldness. She got the laughing on the beach. And I understood at last exactly how little of him had ever truly been mine. Then the librarian woke, the part Walter had talked into giving notice 40 winters ago, the part he was sure he had retired for good. I did not take a single dollar. I did not so much as bend a corner. I took out my phone and photographed everything, one document at a time, bracing my elbows the way I once did over fragile papers for the historical collection, checking each picture was clear before I moved on. The statements, the lease, the ledger with its little note about the inconvenient woman who might suspect. I even photographed the banded cash where it lay, so there could never be an argument about what this safe had held tonight. There was one thing left, at the very bottom, a thick manila envelope, sealed, my own name showing in one corner in that careful, looping hand that was not mine. I reached for it, and out at the end of Larch Street, headlights turned in through the blowing snow, slow and yellow, and an engine I knew too well came growling up toward the house. He was home early. The storm had sent them home early. I did not have time for that envelope. I squared the stacks, set the folders back in order, laid the ledger on the bottom where it had been, and closed the heavy door and felt the bolts seat home. I spun the dial off the 19th of April. I swung the bookcase back along its line, checked it twice, locked the study, and had the spare key pressed back beneath the drawer and the kettle on before his boots ever hit the porch steps. I had gone into that room a wife who suspected. I came out a witness who keeps records. And whatever waited inside that sealed envelope with my name on it, I knew I would have to come back for it. For most of my life, when something frightened me, I went to Walter. That was the cruelest knot in all of it. The man I had been trained for 41 years to turn to in trouble was now the trouble itself. So for the first time I could remember, I had to carry a fear to a stranger and trust her more than I trusted the man whose name I had taken. It took me 3 days to make the call, 3 more to keep the appointment. Her name was Renee Castillo, and she kept a small law office near the old port, a brass nameplate gone soft at the corners, a waiting room that smelled of coffee and old paper. I had chosen her for one reason above all. She was not from our world. She did not sit on Walter's committees. She did not go to our church. She had never once shaken my husband's hand and felt grateful for it. And after what I had begun to learn about how many people in town owed Walter something that mattered more than I can tell you, I nearly did not go in. I sat in my car outside a long while, watching the gulls wheel over the gray harbor, telling myself I was being dramatic, that a good wife sorts these things out at home, that I worried too much. And that last worn old thought was the very one that got me out of the car. I had spent 41 years letting that exact sentence keep me small, and I was done letting it decide what I could do. Renee was younger than me, with steady dark eyes and a way of listening that did not rush a word. I had brought everything, the photographs from the safe, the statements, the condominium file, the ledger with its cold little note about the inconvenient woman who might suspect, and last of all, the marriage record showing Walter had been bound to Frances Pruitt more than 2 years before he married me. I laid it across her desk with hands that were almost steady and watched her face change as she read, the professional calm settling into something sharper and more awake. When she finished, she did not gasp, and she did not pity me, and I was grateful for both. She looked up and said, very evenly, that I had been right to come, right to gather what I had gathered, and that what I held was not the panic of an overwrought wife, but the makings of a strong case. No one had spoken to me like that in years, as though my judgment could be trusted, as though the things I had noticed were real. I had to look down so she would not see what those few plain sentences did to me. Then she told me the rule that carried me through all that came after. In a fight like this, she said, the side that wins is almost never the side with the most feeling. It is the side with the best records. Documentation before emotion. I would have every right in the weeks ahead to feel rage and grief and 100 other things, but I must never let any of them push me into a rash move before the paperwork was in place. The feelings were mine to keep. The documents were what would set me free. But she told me something else, gently, and it is the part I have turned over most since. I should understand what I was up against, not just a man, but a man the whole town loved, with money, friends, and a reputation built over 30 careful years. Women in my position, she said, sometimes imagined the truth would be enough, that they had only to show the world what their husband was. And the hard fact was that it often was not. A beloved man with powerful friends can survive almost any truth, if the people around him would rather not believe it. Our best path was not a loud public reckoning we might lose. It was quiet leverage, gathered carefully, used precisely, settled in a private room. I did not fully understand her yet. I would. Then she walked me through what came first. Before anything else, I needed money of my own. Not cash in a coffee tin, though she smiled kindly when I confessed to that. A real account in my own name that Walter did not know about and could not touch. As long as every dollar I could reach ran through his accounts, she said, I was negotiating with my hands tied. And there was a clock on it, because a man who writes "hold until retirement is finalized" in his own ledger is a man with a date in mind. So I did it that very afternoon. I drove to a bank on the far side of the city, one we had never used, sat down with a young teller, and opened a checking account in the name of Eleanor Whitfield, and Eleanor Whitfield alone. It was not a fortune. It was barely a beginning. But when she slid the paperwork across the counter and I signed my own name on my own account, something happened in my chest I had not felt since I was a girl, before I ever met Walter, before I learned to make myself small. It felt like standing up straight after a lifetime of stooping through a low door. I sat in the bank parking lot afterward and cried. But they were not the tears I had held back for weeks. They were not grief. They were the tears of a woman who has just taken her first real step out of a house she lived in all her life and felt the cold, clean air on her face. That night I made Walter his supper and listened to him talk and smiled in all the right places. And he had no idea anything in the world had changed. But everything had. There was an account now with only my name on it. There was a lawyer now who believed me, and a clock had started ticking that Walter could not hear. I had the documents now, and a lawyer, and an account with my own name on it. And for a few days I let myself believe the hardest part was behind me. I should have known better. The hardest part of bringing down a man like Walter is not finding what he hid. It is discovering how many other people helped him hide it, and how many of them you had loved. It began with a question I should never have asked out loud. There was a winter fellowship luncheon at the church, the kind I had gone to for 41 years. Casseroles in the parish hall, and weak coffee, and the same faces I had known for decades. I went because not going would have looked strange, and I had learned by then to do nothing in the world that looked strange. But I went with my eyes open, the way I did everything now, watching, listening, keeping my own quiet count. Raymond Boyd was there, of course. He had chaired the church finance committee for as long as Walter had served on it. A big, genial man with a politician's handshake, the sort everyone called a pillar of the community. He was the one who had always saved Walter the good seat near the front all those years. He and my husband had been thick as thieves for as long as I could remember, and I had always taken that for a figure of speech. I sat beside him over coffee and made small talk, and then, carefully, almost idly, I let one sentence drop. I said I had been going through some of Walter's old financial papers and had come across a consulting arrangement I did not quite understand. And I wondered whether Raymond might know anything about it. I watched his face. I have spent my whole life watching faces, from behind a library desk and a kitchen counter, the places where women are assumed not to be paying any attention, and I had grown very good at it. Raymond's genial smile did not slip, not quite, but something moved behind his eyes, a quick flicker of calculation, there and gone, the very look I had seen cross Walter's face 100 times. Then he patted my hand and told me, warmly, that Walter had always been a shrewd man with money, and that I should not trouble my head with the complicated parts, that these things were best left to the people who understood them. He said it kindly. He said it the exact way Walter said everything. And in that moment I knew, with a certainty I could not yet prove, that Raymond Boyd knew precisely what my husband had been doing. So I went home, and I did what I had learned to do. I dug. It took several days, and it was not easy. But the records were there for anyone patient enough to read them, and patience was the one thing I had in abundance. Threaded through the same dry filings where Francis's borrowed name appeared, in the indirect way these things are always done, were small favors running in both directions. A loan here, on terms no honest bank would have offered. A property that changed hands at a price that made no sense unless someone was being thanked for something. Raymond's name, and the names of one or two others I had trusted for decades, surfacing just often enough, just quietly enough, to tell a story to anyone who knew how to read between the lines. Walter had not built his secret alone. He had built it inside a circle of respectable men who looked the other way, because looking the other way had been made well worth their while. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the cold knowledge settling into me like the winter coming through the window glass. For 41 years I had lived in a town that admired my husband, that called him solid and good, that saved him the best seat and thanked him for shoveling the widow's walk. And the whole time, some of those same admiring people had known exactly what he was, and had chosen the comfortable silence over the inconvenient truth, because the truth would have cost them something, and the silence cost them nothing. The wall around Walter was not built of his lies alone. It was built, brick by careful brick, of other men's good names, all of them propping one another up, all with a reason to make certain the quiet, invisible wife never started asking questions in the wrong rooms. That was the loneliest night of the whole ordeal. lonelier even than the night I opened the safe. Because that night I understood that I was not one woman against one man. I was one woman against a whole comfortable arrangement of people who would far rather I stayed quiet, who would smile at me over weak coffee and pat my hand and gently, kindly steer me back toward being small. The neighbors, the committee, the men my husband prayed beside on Sunday and golfed with on Saturday. I had believed, when I found the documents, that the truth would be enough, that I had only to show people what Walter was. Now I understood that some of them already knew and had decided, long ago, not to care. I looked around my own kitchen, at the brick house I had kept, and the town I had lived in all my adult life, and I felt the walls of it close in a way they never had before. Renee believed me. Stolen. Renee was a stranger I had chosen precisely because she stood outside all of it. Everyone inside it, every face I had known and trusted and broken bread with for 41 years, was part of the wall. And so I sat alone with my documents and my own name on my own account. And I asked myself the question that would decide everything that came next. The one question I could not yet answer: who was left to trust? I had reached the loneliest point of all of it. I knew what Walter had done. I knew the church had looked away. And I had begun to believe there was no one left who would simply tell me the truth. Then it came from the last place I would have looked, the young lawyer my own husband had hired. His name was Aaron Cole, and Walter had brought him to the house one evening to finish what he called his estate, which I understood now to mean the machinery that would move his money out of my reach the moment he retired. I served them coffee and made myself invisible, the way I had for 41 years, while the young man kept glancing at me over his papers in a way I could not read. It was at the door, when Walter had stepped into the other room, that he stopped. "You probably do not remember me, Mrs. Whitfield." I did not. He smiled in a way that made him look 9 years old, and a memory I had stumbled over weeks before in the library suddenly had a face. The corner table, the boy whose mother cleaned offices at night, the boy I had fed one hard winter, telling him there was an extra ticket so he would take it without shame. He could have walked away then. I have understood that only since, by saying one word to me, the wife of the man who signed his checks. Aaron Cole was breaking the one rule his profession is built on. You do not betray the person who hired you. His whole career, the one a corner table boy had clawed his way into, rested on it. And I watched the cost move across his face and watched him decide anyway. He did not hand me a single document. He was too careful and too decent to drag me into something traceable. He only said very low that if he were me, he would speak to Francis Pruitt, and soon, and that I was to understand he had not said even this. And then he told me the one thing that was not about the case at all. "You fed me once when I was hungry," he said, "and you never made me feel like charity. I have spent 20 years trying to become the kind of man who would pay that back, and I am sorry it is like this." Then he wished me a good evening and was gone. A man who had just set his own livelihood quietly on the scale for a debt I never knew he carried. So I drove up the coast the next morning, along the road where the houses grow small and the salt comes in off the water. Frances Pruitt lived in a gray cottage with a sagging porch and a single light burning against the gloom. I sat in my car 10 minutes before I found the nerve to knock. The woman who opened the door was nothing my imagining had built. I had once braced for a rival, polished and triumphant. What stood in front of me was a tired woman of 66, in a cardigan worn through at the elbow, with frightened eyes and the chain still on the door. She knew who I was before I said it. She went pale and said, through the gap, "I never took anything from you. Please, I never even met you." Her voice shook, and I understood she was as afraid of me as I had once been of Walter. "I am not here to blame you," I said. "I think we are the same." It took a long time for the chain to come off. When it did, she made tea with trembling hands. And at a table with a cracked oilcloth, she told me her story. She had married Walter at 22, before the suits and the committees, when he was charming and broke and full of plans. He grew bored the way men like that do, and one day he was simply gone. No papers, no goodbye. She believed for years she was divorced because he said he would handle it. He never did. Then, more than a decade ago, he came back. Not to her, to her name. "A small favor," he said. "A tax matter, a signature here and there." She signed because she was lonely, and he was familiar, and did not understand what she held. And when she began to suspect, he reminded her, gently, that her name was on everything, that if it ever came apart, she would be the one the law came for. She looked at me across that cracked table and said the thing I will never forget. "He made me feel like the safest thing I could ever do was stay quiet," she said. "Did he do that to you too?" And then, very softly, she told me about the telephone, about the years she had dialed our house in the early evenings, before he was home, lost her nerve, only breathed, and hung up. About the one winter night she had nearly said it, and a hand had come down over the line. "I have wished 1,000 times I had told you," she said. "I just could never make myself stop being afraid of him." I did not say anything. I reached across that cracked oilcloth and took her cold hand in mine, and the two women he had been so certain would never speak to each other sat there while the gray light failed over the water and did not let go. When I left, she walked me to my car, braver than an hour before. She would help, she said. She would tell the truth, all of it, in writing, to whoever I needed. And as I drove home into the falling dark, the loneliness lifted for the first time in weeks, because I finally understood I was not the only one he had locked away. I had simply been the first to find the door. But Aaron's words stayed with me, and soon, somewhere in the city, Walter was moving faster than I knew, and my time was running short. Aaron Cole had told me not to wait, and within a few days I understood exactly why. The thread he had handed me did not lead only to Frances. It led back, when I finally pulled all of it, to the one thing in that safe I had never reached, the sealed envelope at the very bottom, with my own name written across it in a hand that was not mine. Walter had a board dinner 3 nights later, and I went back. The spare key, the bookcase, the dial set to a stranger's birthday. I knelt in front of that open steel door for the last time, took out the envelope, and opened it on the cold floor of that hidden room. It was an insurance policy, a large one, on my life and on the line where the money would go when I was gone. In the careful print of a careful man was Walter's name. I read it 3 times before the meaning settled into my body like cold water going down. I am not a dramatic woman, and I will not stand here and tell you my husband meant to do me harm. I do not know that, but I knelt there and thought of the last 2 years of our marriage, of all the small, new tendernesses that had crept into them, and I understood them for the first time. The way he had begun fussing that I see the doctor about every little ache, the vitamins he set beside my plate each morning, the new and patient interest he took in my blood pressure, in my heart, in how I had been sleeping. I had been so starved for care that I had taken a man counting the value of an asset and called it love. Whatever Walter intended, the policy said one plain thing, and there was no soft way to read it. I was worth more to that man finished than I had ever been worth to him alive. And inconvenient, and asking questions. That was the night the fear finally turned all the way into something useful. I went to Renee the next morning, and I did not weep in her office the way I half expected to. I laid the photographs on her desk in their order, the statements, the ledger, the condominium, and last of all, the policy. And I watched her go still in the way careful people go still when the stakes have just changed under them. She told me, gently, that we now had more than enough. And then she told me the other thing, the thing Aaron had been trying to warn me of without breaking his own oath. A man who has built a plan this complete does not leave it sitting forever. He waits for the right moment. And Walter's right moment was retirement, no longer years away, but weeks. Once the largest transfers cleared, the money would scatter into places no court could easily follow. So I signed the divorce papers there, in Renee's office, with the snow starting again outside her window. I signed my own name, the real one, on my own behalf, for the first time in 41 years. And we set the quiet defenses in motion, the alerts, the holds, the careful flags on every account that still bore both our names, so that the morning Walter reached for his money, he would find a door he could not open. Then I went home to wait, because the one thing I could not do was warn him. It came faster than even Renee had guessed. 2 nights later, a storm shut the city down, and Walter took a call in the study, with the door not quite closed. I stood in the dark hall and listened to my husband of 41 years talk, in a low and even voice, about moving funds first thing in the morning, about getting it settled before anyone asked the wrong question. He did not sound cruel. That was the worst of it. He sounded like a man confirming a dinner reservation. When he hung up, I went back to the kitchen and stood very still. and I understood that the clock I had felt ticking for weeks had just begun its final hour. I did not panic. The bank already had its holds. Renee already had the papers. There was nothing left to do that night, and so I did the most ordinary thing in the world. I made my husband a cup of tea. I want you to understand how ordinary it was. I steeped the bag the 3 minutes he preferred, not a second more. I set it on the saucer with a small chip he never noticed. I carried it down the hall to the study, where he tilted his page away from me the moment I came in, the way he had tilted it away for 41 years. He said thank you without looking up, and I walked back to the kitchen, and I knew that this was the last ordinary evening of my marriage, and that he did not know it at all. Because in the morning, when Walter came down those stairs expecting his careful life to go on exactly as it always had, he would not find his money waiting to be moved. He would find an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside it, divorce papers, signed. And one sheet more, in my own hand, the very hand he had once sat and practiced until he could sign my life away without a tremor. On that sheet were 4 words. I knew everything, Walter. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe, this stranger I had served and feared and loved, and I felt no triumph and no fear, only a great and final stillness, like the quiet that settles over the harbor after a storm has finally blown itself out. By the time he read those 4 words, it would already be far too late for him to do anything at all. I asked them all to come on a Sunday afternoon, the way I had asked them to come for 41 years of birthdays and holidays. Paul arrived first, still in his work jacket, tired the way he always looked now. Laura came a few minutes later with little Charlie, and I told her gently that Charlie could sit in the den with his coloring books, because what I had to say was not for an 8-year-old. She searched my face a long moment, and I think some part of her already knew. Walter came in last, though he lived there. He had been in his study, and when he walked into the living room and saw the 3 of us sitting together, he stopped in the doorway and did the thing he always did, the quick calculation, the smooth recovery, the warm, reasonable smile he wore for the church and the neighbors. He said it was nice to have everyone together. He asked if I had made coffee. I had not made coffee. I had made copies. On the table sat a plain folder, and I slid it across to my children and asked them to open it themselves, because I needed them to see it with their own eyes and not just hear it in their mother's words. I had spent too many years being the woman who worried too much. I wanted no room left for that. Paul opened it first. And here is the thing I had not let myself prepare for. My son did not believe me. He read the first few pages, then closed the folder, almost gently, and said, "Mom." He said it the way you speak to someone you love who is not quite well. "Dad has explained the accounts to me before," he said. "There are reasons things are set up this way." He looked at his father, and Walter gave a small, sad nod, the nod of a patient man. And Paul turned back to me and said, "I think you have gotten yourself worked up over something you do not fully understand." It very nearly broke me, that sentence. Not because it was cruel, but because it was the exact sentence Walter had used on me for 41 years, and now it was coming out of my own son's mouth. And I understood in that instant how completely the man had built his world. He had not only made the town love him, he had made my own children into people who would defend him without even knowing they were doing it. I did not argue. Arguing was what he wanted. Instead, I reached into the folder and took out one single page, the marriage record, and laid it in front of Paul and said only, "Read that one. Read it slowly." I watched my son read it twice. I watched the patient look on his face come apart. He set the page down very carefully, the way you set down a thing you are afraid you might throw. And he said, "Dad, who is Frances Pruitt?" Walter said nothing. Laura had not spoken at all. She had her hand flat on the table, as though she needed it to stay upright. And now she pulled the photographs toward her, the banded stacks of cash, and I watched the moment the truth reached her. But it was not anger that came first. It was shame. "I believed you," she said, very quietly. "When Charlie was in the hospital and you sat at this table and told me we had to be careful, I went home and felt guilty for asking." She looked up at her father, and her voice did not rise, which made it worse. "You let me feel guilty," she said, "for trying to save my own son's life." The room went very still. Outside, the snow had started again, soft against the windows. Then Walter tried the thing I knew he would try. He turned to me and lowered his voice, the way he always did when he wanted a conversation to be just between us, where he could manage it. He said my name softly, "Eleanor. You do not want to do this in front of them." And there it was, the whole of it, laid bare in a single sentence. For 41 years he had made certain no one was ever in the room. Every refusal, every careful no had happened where only I could hear it, so that it was always his word against the wife who worried too much. So I had brought the room. I had brought witnesses. I had taken away the one weapon that had ever truly worked on me. "Yes, Walter," I said. "I do." Paul stood and walked to the window with his back to us, and when he turned around, his face had changed in a way I will never forget. "I helped you," he said, almost to himself. "Last spring, you had me sign some papers. You said it was for the estate." He looked ill. "What did I sign, Dad?" Walter did not answer, and the silence said everything. And I watched my son understand that the father he had spent his whole life admiring had used him too, the way he used everyone, the way he used a borrowed name and a forged signature and a frightened woman up the coast. I told them then, calmly and in order, what I had done, that I had a lawyer, that I had my own account, that the bank already knew. Laura came around the table and put her arms around me, and Paul stood between his parents looking lost, a grown man learning that the foundation of his whole life had been a stage set the entire time. Charlie called out from the den, asking if everything was okay. I called back that yes, sweetheart, everything was finally okay. And Walter stood alone in the center of the room he had ruled for 41 years, watching his family rearrange itself around him into a shape that no longer had a place for him in it. And I understood that the man the whole town still admired had just become a stranger in his own home. The mediation took place on a gray morning in a conference room downtown, a long table and a window that looked out over the harbor. the water the color of old pewter under a low sky. I had imagined this morning for weeks. What I had not imagined was how calm I would feel, and how that calm would be the most dangerous thing I brought into a room with Walter. He had a lawyer now, a sharp young man in a sharp suit. And Walter looked the way he always did in front of people he wanted to impress, pressed and pleasant and sorry in advance for the inconvenience. Renee sat on my right with 3 folders squared in front of her. A mediator named Ms. Albright sat at the head of the table and explained that the purpose of the day was a fair division of marital property. And that was the very word Walter's lawyer reached for first, marital property. He said it gently, almost apologetically, then laid down his own piece of paper, and I understood Walter had been preparing too. His lawyer said there was a question of whether there had ever been a marriage at all. He said it as though it pained him. He pointed out in a soft, careful voice that records suggested Mr. Whitfield had entered a prior marriage that may never have been legally dissolved, and that if so, my 41 years were not a marriage in the eyes of the law, but something with no standing at all, which meant I had no claim to marital property because there had been no marriage to divide. It was a beautiful trap. He had taken the very thing I thought was my weapon and turned the blade back on me. For one long second, the old fear rose in me, the cold certainty that Walter would win the way he always won, by being 3 steps ahead while I was still learning the rules. But I had not come into that room alone, and I had not come unprepared. I looked at Renee, and Renee did not so much as blink. She opened the second folder. She said very evenly that her client was well aware of the prior marriage. That was precisely why we were not relying on marital property law at all. And then she laid it out, page by page, what that marriage actually meant. It meant Walter Whitfield had knowingly entered a second marriage while still legally bound to a first wife, which is a crime. It meant he had then used that first wife's name, Frances Pruitt, for over a decade to hold accounts and sign for a company, moving money she never understood and never saw a dollar of. Another crime, a federal one, and it meant the years of transfers in those folders were not a quiet retirement plan. They were a paper trail. Renee said we had no wish to pursue any of it. We had not gone to the authorities. We had not gone to the United States Attorney. We had come here instead, to a quiet room, to settle a fair division in private. She let that sit. She did not have to say the rest. Every person at that table understood it. We could keep it quiet, or it did not have to stay quiet at all. Walter's lawyer asked for a recess. They were gone 50 minutes. I sat by the window and watched a single fishing boat work out past the breakwater, small and stubborn against all that gray water, and thought, that is me. That is what I look like now. When they came back, the sharp suit had gone soft at the edges. The offer changed, and changed again. By noon, the hidden accounts were on the record. The condominium would be sold, and a fair half of all Walter had spent a decade hiding was placed where it belonged, in my own name, under my own control. He signed it the way a man signs when the only thing left to protect is the version of himself that other people still believe in. I want to tell you about Frances, because for a long time I had imagined her as the other woman, and the truth was sadder than that. Renee made certain the agreement stated in plain ink that Frances Pruitt had been a woman Walter used and not a partner in his scheme. I did not do it for praise. I did it because I had spent my whole life being a woman whose truth no one bothered to write down, and I would not let another woman carry a lie that was not hers. At the end, when the papers were signed and Ms. Albright had stepped out, Walter looked at me across that long table, and for one moment the smile and the strategy were both gone, and what was underneath surprised me. "You used to laugh at everything," he said, very quietly, so the lawyers could not hear. "I do not know when you stopped." And the terrible thing was that he meant it. For one breath, I saw the young man who had made me laugh in a library 42 years ago, before he decided loving me cost more than he cared to pay. And I understood he had loved some version of me, in his way, the way a man loves a thing he owns. It was not enough. It never had been. But it had been real once, and that was almost harder to carry than if he had felt nothing at all. "I stopped the day I realized you were counting," I said. Then I gathered my papers and walked out into a hallway that smelled of coffee and floor wax and ordinary life. And the cold, bright air outside felt like something I was finally allowed to breathe. There would be no headlines, no handcuffs. The town would go on calling him a good man, and I let it, because some prices you pay gladly for your own freedom. I had not won the kind of victory that makes the evening news. I had won the only kind that was ever truly mine. Walter is dead now. I should tell you that plainly, because plain is the only way I know how to say it. He died last spring, in his sleep, an hour up the coast, near the water he had always meant to retire beside. 71 years old. His heart, the doctor said. I have thought more than once that it was the one honest thing about him, that heart, to simply stop. I did not go to the funeral, but I heard about it, the way you hear about everything in a town like ours. The church was full. People stood out in the cold parking lot because there were no seats left inside. Raymond Boyd gave the eulogy and called him a man of quiet generosity, a man you could trust with anything. The choir sang. The widow Calloway wept in the front pew for the man who used to shovel her walk. And somewhere in the back of all that grief sat my son Paul, who knows exactly what his father was, holding his own son's hand and saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say that anyone in that church would have wanted to hear. That is the part nobody warns you about. I want to be honest with you because no one was honest with me. When you finally win against a man like that, you do not get the ending you imagined. There is no moment when the truth stands up in front of everyone and the whole town gasps. Walter died a good man. He will stay a good man. There is a small brass plaque now in the parish hall with his name on it, thanking him for 30 years of faithful service to the church accounts. I have seen it. I did not take it down. I am not sure I could have, and I am not sure it would have changed a thing. So let me tell you what winning actually looks like, since the stories never do. It looks like a small apartment over the harbor where the radiator knocks all night and the bookshelves are finally, every one of them, my own. It looks like a checking account with a single name on it. It looks like waking in the morning and noticing, with something close to surprise, that the first thought of the day is no longer, be careful. And it looks like carrying a thing you can never set down, because I know what he was, and Francis knows, and Paul and Laura know, and Renee knows, and Aaron Cole knows. Wherever he landed after he walked away from a man he could no longer stomach. But the world does not know. The world got the good man. I got the truth. And the truth, it turns out, is a heavy thing to carry alone in a town that would rather not hear it. People think the hard part is the lie. It is not. The hard part is the silence that comes after, when you are finally free and finally right, and there is still not one soul you are allowed to say it to out loud. Frances and I write to each other now. She is the only person living who carries the same weight I do, the only one who knew him the way I knew him. And there is a strange comfort in that. Two women who were each so certain they were alone. We do not speak of Walter much. We speak of her garden and my grandson and the slow, ordinary business of being old women who are, at last, nobody's secret. She signs her letters, your friend. I keep them in a drawer that does not lock, because nothing in my life locks anymore. And I have come to love that more than I can tell you. I have wondered since whether I would do it differently if I could, whether I should have taken it all the way, gone to the law, let the headlines come, let his good name burn to the ground in front of the whole town. There were nights I wanted that so badly I could taste it. But I had 2 children and a grandchild, and a borrowed name belonging to a frightened woman up the coast, and a truth that would have set fire to them too. So I chose the quiet kind of justice, the kind that fits inside a private room. I will not pretend to you that it never aches. It aches every single time I pass that plaque. But here is what I learned, and it is the only thing I am sure enough of to put into your hands. For 41 years, I believed the most dangerous door in my house was the one behind the bookcase in Walter's study. I was wrong. The most dangerous door was the one inside me, the one I had taught myself year by year to walk past without looking, because looking would have cost me the only life I knew. He did not build that door. I did. And the one thing I will ever be able to forgive myself for is that, in the end, late and afraid and almost too late, I finally opened it. So before you go, let me ask you the question I had to ask myself. 41 years too late. What is the door in your own house you have trained yourself not to see? Whose hand keeps the accounts you have never once been shown? What is the quiet, wrong thing you have decided 100 times over not to look at, because looking might cost you the only life you know? You do not have to bring the whole house down. You do not have to win the way I won or lose the way I lost. You only have to do the one thing I waited a lifetime to do. Look, that is all. Just look, and whatever you find behind that door, I promise you this much, from a woman who waited far too long to find out: it is better to know and be free than to be safe and never have lived at all.